Grandfather would not allow it, I said with confidence. If Mother is still out in the country, then we two shall care for each other. He doesn't know the first thing about shopping at the market or cooking, and I need him to chop wood, and he will make sure I am well. It is good that you have each other, Mrs. Bowles said in the same placid voice, but you should not leave your house once you arrive. The streets of Philadelphia are more dangerous than your darkest nightmare. Fever victims lay in the gutters, thieves and wild men lurk on every corner. The markets have little food. You can't wander. If you are determined to return home with your grandfather, then you must stay there until the fever abates. Grandfather turned to address us. We may end up at the Luddingtons' farm after all, he said. Josiah here tells me there's not much food to be found anywhere, Maddie. I'll write to them again as soon as we arrive home. Won't do you no good, the driver interrupted. The post office just closed down. It could take until Christmas before they can deliver letters. Mrs. Bowles patted my arm. Don't fret, Matilda. If you like, you may choose to take employment at the orphanage. I'm sure the trustees would approve a small wage if you helped with the cleaning or minding the children. They have for Susanna. She'll help with the laundry. Susanna didn't look strong enough to wash a teaspoon, much less a tub full of clothing. What will happen to her when the fever is over? I whispered. Mrs. Bowles lowered her voice. She is at a difficult age. She's too old to be treated as a child, but not old enough to be released on her own. Her parents owned a small house. The trustees will sell that and use the money for her dowry. We will hire her out to work as a servant or scullery maid. She's attractive enough. I'm sure she'll find a husband. A fly bit the ear of the child on Mrs. Bowles' lap, and his howl cut off the conversation. Scullery maid, that was one thing I would never be. I imagined Mother's face when she arrived home and found what a splendid job I had done running the coffee house. I could just picture it. I would be seeing the last customers out the door when Mother would come up the steps. She would exclaim how clean and well run the coffee house was. Grandfather would point out the fancy dry goods store I was building next door. I would blush, looking quite attractive in my new dress. French, of course. Perhaps I could hire Susanna to do the washing up. That would be a way of helping. I broke off my daydream to take in our surroundings. Grandfather and the driver had stopped swapping stories. He turned to look back at me anxiously. We were in the center of a dying city. It was night in the middle of the day. Heat from the brick houses filled the street like a bake oven. Clouds shielded the sun. Colors were overshot with gray. No one was about. Businesses were closed and the houses shuttered. I could hear a woman weeping. Some houses were barred against intruders. Yellow rags fluttered from railings and door knockers. Pus yellow, fear yellow, to mark the homes of the sick and dying. I caught sight of a few men walking, but they fled down alleys at the sound of the wagon. What's that? I asked, pointing to something on the marble steps of a 3-story house. Don't look, Matilda, said Grandfather. Turn your head and say a prayer. I looked. It appeared to be a bundle of bed linens that had been cast out of an upper window, but then I saw a leg and an arm. It's a man. Stop the wagon. We must help him. He is past helping, miss, the driver said as he urged on the horses. I checked him on the way out to fetch you this morning. He were too far gone to go to the hospital. His family tossed him out so as they wouldn't catch the fever. The death cart will get him soon for burying. I couldn't help but stare as the wagon rolled by the stoop. He looked about 17 and wore well-tailored clothes strained with the effects of the fever. Only his polished boots remained clean. His yellow eyes stared lifelessly at the clouds and flies collected on his open mouth. Won't there be a burial, a church service? I asked as the driver turned east onto Walnut Street. Most preachers are too sick or too exhausted to rise from their beds. A few stay in the square during the day. That takes care of the praying. How could the city have changed so much? Yellow fever was wresting the life out of Philadelphia, infecting the cobblestones, the trees, the nature of the people. Was I living through another nightmare? What date is this? I asked Mrs. Bowles. Today is September the 24th, she answered. The 24th? That's not possible. I counted on my fingers. We fled on the 8th. When we left, there were reports of 1,000 dead. Do you know what the total is now? It's double that at least, she said. It slowed down those few cool days, but as soon as the temperature rose again, so did the number of corpses. The driver pulled on his reins to stop the horses. The road was blocked by a line of slow-moving carts, each pushed by a man with a rag tied over his face, each holding a corpse. The potter's field is ahead, Mrs. Bowles said as she pointed to the front of the line. That's where they're burying most of the dead. The preachers say a prayer and someone throws a layer of dirt on top. Along one side of the square stretched a long row of mounded earth. The grave diggers had dug trenches as deeply as they could, then planted layer after layer of fever victims. Some of the dead were decently sewn into their winding sheets, but most were buried in the clothes they died in. A field plowed by the devil, I murmured. They're not even using coffins. I haven't seen a coffin for 4 or 5 days now, the driver answered. He flicked the reins and urged the horses on. At Fifth Street, the wagon stopped. Here's the orphan house, said Mrs. Bowles. We've taken over the home of William Ralston, though we'll soon need more room. It was an ordinary-looking house, more expensive than some, but typical of Philadelphia. Brick front windows trimmed in white paint, metal railings, and a thick oaken door. The driver helped down Mrs. Bowles and Susanna, then each of the children. Mrs. Bowles put Susanna in charge of shepherding 3 of the children inside and stayed to wave goodbye. The driver climbed back into his seat, then flicked the reins on the horses' backs. Remember what I said, Matilda, she called. Take care, whatever you do, take care. Chapter 17, September 24th, 1793. I cannot anticipate nor limit the period when the devastation and horror too long experienced in this miserable place will have an end. Letter of John Walsh, Clerk, Philadelphia, 1793. By the time we reached the coffee house, it was midday. An ugly scrap from a ripped bodice was still tied to the handle of the front door, which was open. I jumped out of the wagon before it had stopped moving. I leapt up the steps and burst through the doorway. Grandfather, hurry! The front room was a jumble. Tables and chairs lay helter-skelter. The clock was missing from the mantel. The pewter candle holders were nowhere to be found. King George's birdcage lay on the floor in pieces as if smashed by a heavy boot. Grandfather hadn't seen the foul-mouthed parrot in days. Had he come home and flown off again? The destruction in the kitchen was greater. Broken pottery covered the floor. The doors to the pantry stood open, and Eliza's crocks of preserves, the sugar cone, and her spice cabinet were missing. The coffee and tea canisters lay on their sides empty. The dried meat, beans, and onions that usually hung from the ceiling had vanished. Even the kitchen table was overturned. Something crunched behind me. I whirled around, but it was only Grandfather picking his way across the broken plates. What happened here? He asked quietly. His eyes moved over the mess, but it did not look like he could make sense of it. I was just here a few days ago. I locked the door, Maddie, I'm sure. His voice was on the edge of trembling. I picked up the pieces of broken glass. Don't fret, I said. Someone broke in the window. You locked the door, Grandfather. It's not your fault. Did they take anything from upstairs? My heart thudded against my stays. Before Grandfather could say another word, I had lifted my skirts and raced up the staircase. The second floor looked as I had left it, except that Mother was missing. The powerful stench of sickness lingered. I opened the windows and shutters to bring in fresh air and then crossed the hall. My bed was still in Grandfather's chamber. I glanced in to make sure everything was in its place. The room still held his presence, his books on the nightstand with an old pipe. A painting of Grandmother hung over his bed with a picture of the farm where he grew up beside it. Whoever destroyed the first floor hadn't bothered coming up here. I went downstairs to rejoin Grandfather. The clothes press at the bottom of the stairs was untouched. The bed linens and tablecloths stacked in it as neatly as if Mother had set them there a moment ago. I lingered in front of it. It was almost possible to forget everything if I just focused on the scent of lavender and clean cotton and the beeswax that made the wood glow. Grandfather was picking through the broken chairs in the front room, trying to salvage something to sit on. I opened all the windows and propped open the doors. There wasn't a breath of air to be had. The room still held the faint smell of coffee and tobacco smoke, but dust coated the furniture and the floor. Spider webs hung in the corners of the room. It felt like I had been gone a lifetime. "Have a seat, girl," Grandfather instructed. "You're still weak." "Only if you sit as well," I said. "Your face is as red as an overripe cherry." I did not mention how hard he was breathing. We moved 2 chairs to the door where the air was a mite cooler. He massaged his left arm. "Old battle wound," he said when he noticed my concern. "This arm goes pins and needles from time to time. The heat doesn't help any, nor this commotion." He was still breathing hard, but his eyes had lost that glazed look they'd had in the kitchen. He needed a good night's sleep in his own bed, I decided. "Right. When you were here a few days ago, everything was in order and locked up tight. You thought that Mother had gone to the Luddingtons' farm." "And Eliza," he said. "She would have asked Eliza to join her." "Eliza wouldn't go. She has family here and would have wanted to help. You know Eliza would never run from trouble." He nodded his head. "Whoever came here didn't go above stairs," I continued. "Maybe they saw the fever rag and thought there was still an invalid in the house." "It didn't stop them from destroying everything they touched," he said. "Was anything else stolen?" "Food. They took every scrap of food in the kitchen, even I froze, the strong box." I fumbled with the tread of the hollow stair, then threw it to the side and lifted out the metal box. I opened the lid. It was still there, pence and shillings. Thank heaven for that. I returned the box to its hiding place. It could be worse, I thought. The house is still standing. We're alive. Mother and Eliza must be somewhere safe. I had to believe that. The fever would soon be over, and our lives would return to normal. I just had to stay clever and strong and find something to eat. A tear surprised me by rolling down my cheek. "None of that, Maddie girl," I whispered to myself as I scrubbed the tear away. "This is not the time to be childish." A familiar yowl came from the back door. Silas waited at the threshold, unwilling to risk his paws on the messy floor. I carried him in to Grandfather. "Here's a friendly face," I said as I held the cat close. "He seems healthy enough." I scratched between his ears. Silas rubbed his face in my hair. "Why didn't you scare those intruders away?" "They probably fed the beast a bite of ham, and he showed them the way to Eliza's goodies," said Grandfather. He tried to lift his sword and scabbard to its place over the mantel, but his arms shook too badly. I let Silas down and took the sword from him. "Let me help you," I said. I raised the sword to its resting place. "Thank you, my sweet," Grandfather said. "Don't know what's come over me." "I know," I said firmly. "We've just come through a battle, and you need time to recuperate." I wagged my finger at him like a commanding officer. "Captain Cook, you must report to your bedroll immediately for an extended leave." "Sir?" "Fresh water will be fetched for you." He saluted me. "Yes, ma'am, General Matty." I listened with envy as his boots shuffled up the stairs and clumped into his chamber. I wanted to take a nap. Why couldn't someone else come to clean up the mess and fetch the water? Silas looked at me skeptically. "You're right," I sighed. "If I don't do it, no one will. But first, I need something to eat. Even Mother believed in a good meal before chores. Let's get Grandfather's water and see what we can salvage for supper." Silas followed me outside. Oh my gracious, the garden looked dead. Insects had devoured most of the leaves and vegetables, leaving behind skeletons of stems and branches. Weeds had exploded between the neat rows. All those weeks of back-breaking work had been for nothing. Hot tears threatened, but my grumbling stomach was more painful. I drew a bucket of water from the well and used the dipper to drink as much as I could hold. I spilled the dipper over the top of my head, shivering as the cold water trickled down my back. I carried the bucket inside and poured a mug for Grandfather. He was already asleep by the time I entered his room. His color was better, and he was snoring like a barn full of plow horses. I set the mug on the floor and tiptoed back downstairs. The ground was baked too hard to use the hoe. I decided to pull up what I could and hope to find something edible overlooked by varmints. A cloud of bugs swarmed around my face every time I touched a withered plant. I weeded the bean patch and found a few hidden string beans for my efforts. The cabbage plants were so infested with worms I couldn't bring myself to look at them. Every few minutes I crawled under the cherry tree for shade and another cool drink of water. Ants covered the cherries that lay on the ground, but I found enough on the tree to settle my stomach. Silas climbed up to a cozy nook between two branches and went to sleep. I'll not forget all your help, wretched cat, I muttered as I knelt in the squash patch. An hour later, I examined my treasure on the kitchen table. 2 handfuls of green beans, 4 stunted crickneck squash that had been nibbled by mice, and a few sour cherries. I divided the meal into 2 piles, one for me and one for grandfather. Not exactly a banquet, is it? I asked Silas. Silas jumped on the table and lapped the water in my mug. Oh, no, you don't, I said as I lifted Silas off the table. We still have rules, even if Mother isn't here to enforce them. Cats eat on the floor. I poured a bit of water into what was left of a bowl for him. I tasted a green bean, tough as leather but not as tasty. I suddenly remembered what was missing. I pushed the bean to the side of my mouth and bowed my head. Thank you, Father, for keeping me alive. Please punish the terrible people who wrecked our home and stole our food. No, that's not right. They were probably hungry. Punish them a little for taking so much. They should have left something behind, and they had no reason to break things. Deal with them as you see fit. Please take care of Mother, Eliza, and Grandfather. I sat in silence for a moment. And Nathaniel.